Hello, Highlanders and beauties and beats, and welcome to my audio blog. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I will be back to reading my poetry and our chit-chat next time, but today I am going to read from my YA fantasy novel, The Wisp. Now, some of you may already be familiar with this story and maybe even heard one of the older recordings. Today I'm going to read from the most recent version of The Wisp. I listened to some of the older recordings and I have to be honest, I'm not really happy with them. And I was looking to put the recordings on Rumble. So rather than putting some of the older and dated versions, I've decided to do a fresh recording. Now the goal of this audio blog remains the same, and that is to soothe and comfort you. And I can't think of anything more soothing than listening to a bedtime story, or maybe a nap time story if it's the middle of the day. So sit back and join me for The Wisp. Gentle gusts blew through layers of whispering leaves. Those with the lightest grip let go and cut red and gold traces through the air. They settled soundlessly on the pavement below. Above, a low-hanging sun shared the sky with a pale crescent that had just crested the horizon. A morning moon at dusk, her mother called it. It was a lovely evening, but Bara walked alone. Not another living soul. An empty town at a time when the residents of Windfall were usually rushing home for dinner. How strange. But then there was an insistent tug on her sleeve. Not alone after all. Bara looked down. A girl of 4 or 5 years old looked back up. She wore a red peacoat with a matching beret. Curls, not far off the shade of Bara's own strawberry blonde, scooped down and brushed her collar. Dark glasses with white frames, heart-shaped, hid her eyes. She said nothing, but a tear escaped from below a plastic rim and trailed down a plump cheek. "Are you lost?" Bara asked. "Do you want me to help you find your mummy?" The girl nodded and held out a chubby hand. Bara reached out but was jostled from behind before her fingers could take hold. The street was full now. Where had they all come from? A steady stream of men and women pushed and shoved as they passed. Halloween was over, yet they were all dressed in costumes from the past. All wore dark glasses. Bara looked down again. The girl had gone, but not far. She now stood under the shade of an oak tree a few meters away. A tall man, made even taller by a black top hat, had her by the arm. She struggled to get free. Something told Bara he wasn't her father. A protective spirit surged in her. She fought her way through the crowd and threw her slight 16-year-old body at his massive frame. The man merely stepped back, but he did let go of the girl. "Run," Bara told her. The girl didn't hesitate. Her short legs took flight and she disappeared into the crowd. There'd be no escape for Bara. Dark gloved hands reached out and took hold of her shoulders. She looked up, opened her mouth to protest, but never uttered a word. Sudden terror had squeezed her throat shut. Under the brim of the man's top hat were 2 empty black holes where his eyes should have been. His eyelids quivered, and something that shouldn't be there, rolled inside his skull in waves of oily black and silver. The man gave a wry smile and let out a chuckle that cracked with charge. His hands moved up from her shoulders and took hold of her throat. His fingers stiffened. The realization hit. "He's going to kill me." Bara struggled. Her flailing arms made contact with no one and nothing. His smile grew wider. His grip tightened and closed off her windpipe. He lifted her from her feet. Her toes just grazed the asphalt below, and she was in the air. Only for a moment. His hands loosened from her throat. She fell to her knees. The man then left the ground. With her face hidden under an abundance of red gold curls, a girl about Bara's own shape and size held him aloft with only one arm. Odd, she also wore a red peacoat and beret. "She is mine," came her hissing voice. As if he were no more than a rag doll, she tossed the man aside. Before making contact with the ground, he exploded in a burst of silver and screams. Charges trailed and sizzled through the air. When the sound and movement finally died down, a cloud of silver dust hung and then dropped with a heavy thud. The wind blew away the dust, and the man was gone. Thinking the nightmare over, Bara looked at her rescuer. Her rescuer turned to her. The nightmare wasn't over. There stood a mirror image. Same shape, size, hair, and face. A doppelganger. Everything was the same. Everything but the eyes. They were black and empty, just as the man's had been. The doppelganger cocked her head to the side. With a hand as gentle as a venomous snake, she bent down and reached out for Bara's cheek. "Hush, hush," she cooed and stroked. Her youthful mouth turned down. 2 heavy folds grew from her nose, dragging her cheeks until they sagged below her chin. Crow's feet formed around her black eyes and spread until they reached a now gray hairline. Deep crevices pocked and ran across a once smooth forehead. Bara stared at herself as an old woman. "I am here now," her demented double reassured. "Everything is just fine." Everything wasn't just fine, not even close. The doppelganger smiled a wide smile that grew wider still. Wrinkles bent and twisted under the strain of an ever-increasing black hole of a mouth that threatened to erase its face. But in the next instant, it closed and returned to normal. She turned her head, as though at a sound, and then back at Bara. "Soon," she whispered, and then disappeared in a storm of silver and electricity. The doppelganger was gone. The man was gone. All the other passerbys had disappeared too. But Bara wasn't alone. A solitary form approached. The dark-haired boy. Everything was all right now. This boy she knew. He was tall and lean with broad shoulders. His strides long, his hair, dark and wavy, shone copper in a sun setting too rapidly to be real. The sun slipped below the horizon like a coin into a slot. The sky disappeared into night, and the world dimmed to darkness. Bara heard her own breathing, fast and shallow. His breath was strong and even. He was so close now. Her fingers found his warm cheek. She stepped closer, and he opened his arms. Like someone had thrown a switch, the moon lit up the night sky. Stars burst through the black. His eyes, vibrantly blue, smiled down at her. His lips brushed her mouth. She returned the kiss, wishing it would go on forever. It didn't. They were tortured until they confessed. For those who continued to deny their guilt, there was a test, the water test. A suspected witch was held under water. If she died, she was found innocent and buried in sacred ground. If she lived, she was assumed a demon's handmaiden. Death by burning was her fate. Professor Chestermere paused and sipped at his coffee. The students of St. Catherine's Academy for Girls, St. Cat, were studying the witch trials of Europe. Most of the girls were too worried about their upcoming exam to ask questions. The only sounds outside Chestermere's voice were the low murmurs of clicking keyboards or the even smaller scratch of pen on paper. Until Bara did the unthinkable. She raised her hand. Like having just one hair out of place on a thickly gelled and smoothed head, it instantly caught his attention. "Yes, Miss Kavanagh. Didn't Windfall have its own witch trials?" The question wasn't met with any real curiosity from the rest of the class. It wouldn't be on the test. Keyboards stopped clicking, pens stopped writing. Most of the girls phased out, but Cassandra rolled her eyes, Louise snorted, and several other pops, the most powerful clique at school, followed suit by giggling. Bara, despite her good looks and money, wasn't popular. She wasn't counted among the brains, and she certainly wasn't a goth. She had only two real friends, Amy Frank and Colin Von Fitt, from the neighboring St. Xavier's Academy for Boys, St. X. Chestermere laughed good-naturedly. Quite right, Miss Kavanagh. Salem, Massachusetts, is most often remembered for its witch trials of 1692, but Windfall did indeed have its own Petite Inquisition. He paused and took another sip of his coffee. His mug claimed he was the #1 teacher. He placed the self-congratulatory mug on his desk, put his hands into the pocket of his sweater vest, puffed out his sizable chest and belly, and rocked on his heels. This was a sign he was about to go on, and possibly on some more. Sly smiles crept onto teenage faces. The more time he spent off-topic, the less facts they'd have to memorize. Forbidden cell phones emerged from bags and pockets, browsers opened to banned websites. "If I remember correctly," he continued, "it was 5 women and 1 man found guilty. They were sentenced to burn at the stake, except for one. Her they intended to bury alive." The mention of burning flesh and live burials grabbed the attention of a few others. Patsy Pillinger among them, the only girl less popular than Bara. "Did they really burn them?" she blurted out. Patsy hadn't raised her hand. Chestermere narrowed his eyes in rebuke before answering. "There's no record of anyone actually having been burnt or buried. Rumor is remains were sunk in a lake north of Windfall. It has since dried up and with no signs of bones. So perhaps the townsfolk saw sense before putting a match to light." "Did they really believe in witches?" Bara asked. Most of the other girls realized no grotesque story of witch burning was to come, and shifted focus back to where it had been. The tech-inclined texted or surfed, the brains caught up on homework. Most everyone else drifted back to daydreams. Bara was the only one listening, but a touch on her shoulder split her focus. There soon came a second, more insistent summons. This one sparked on contact. She turned around. A bright glare came through the window. She brought her hand up to shield her face and blinked. The light disappeared. When her vision cleared, there was Amy with her head down in a math textbook. Amy didn't look up. She hadn't tapped her shoulder. Maybe someone had thrown a wad of paper. The Pops often used Bara as target practice. But Louise and Cassandra had their heads down, their concentration focused on their laps. Their hands moved slightly. They both giggled, one after the other. They were obviously texting each other, and hadn't been them either. Bara continued to look around. No one met her eye, no one was avoiding it, but no way had she imagined the touch. Chestermere interrupted her thoughts. "Really, Miss Kavanagh, you asked the question. It's only common courtesy you await the answer before turning your attention elsewhere." She turned back. He'd grown red in the face. His thick neck bobbed in his starched collar. He resembled a boiling kettle top. It was hard not to laugh. She did her best to stifle her giggles. "I'm sorry," she said. I was distracted. Someone tapped me on the shoulder." "That could only have been Miss Frank." Amy raised her head. Miss Frank, did you tap Miss Kavanagh on the shoulder? Amy looked blankly. His voice rose in volume. Of course you didn't. Somebody quipped. A Barbie was off in her Malibu mansion. No, someone else, no doubt a pop, chimed in. Her dad lives with Barbie now. Ouch. The Kavanaghs were freshly divorced, and Mr. Kavanagh now married to a much younger and blonder woman. Barrow was far from okay with it. There were unkind snickers all around. Chestermere held up his hand to signal for silence. No, Miss Frank, your interest was elsewhere, as was Miss Kavanagh's. He looked pointedly at Barra. Would you like me to finish? She nodded. He scanned the classroom. Those looking up nudged those who weren't. Browsers closed. Electronic devices were put away. All eyes faced forward. Well then, he began again. The women were jailed and tortured. The question is, why? Did the townspeople truly believe in witchcraft? Witches? Demons? The devil? No one responded, and he answered his own question. They may have practiced ancient ways of healing, non-Christian religion, nature worship and such, but communing with the dark side? He looked ominously at the goss, smiled and shrugged. I don't think so. More likely, the not-so-good townsfolk wanted the wealth the women would lose if they were found guilty. They were all without a husband, widowed or orphaned, and all held property. Greed was the obvious motive. He took another sip of coffee and continued on with the lesson. Again keyboards clicked, pens scribbled. Barra snuck a look back. Amy gave her a sympathetic smile in return. The bell rang. Chestermere reminded the class of their upcoming exam and dismissed everyone. The girls began to pack up and exit. The Goths all but flew out of the room, their long black hair flapping like crow wings behind them. Everyone else moved at varying but slower speeds. Barra slid her laptop into her bag and was ready to go. Amy took longer, with pens and highlighters and notebooks to put away. I have to go to tech and sign out a computer, she told Barra. Do you want to come with? Then we can go to the library. She finished packing up and headed for the door. Barra followed behind and yawned. I need caffeine. They spoke in hushed tones as they walked down the hall. Cassandra and Louise watched. They stood near the exit with the other pops gathered around, paying court. You dreamed about him again? Amy asked. Barra was having a reoccurring dream about a dark-haired boy. The dreams were pleasant enough. Okay, maybe too pleasant. They left her with a sense of longing when she woke up and realized he didn't really exist. But the last dream had been terrifying too. An eyeless doppelganger with a mouth threatening to eat its own face. Not exactly sweet dream material. Getting back to sleep afterward had been a struggle. Barra was exhausted. I'll get you some coffee, she offered, then meet you down in the stacks. Amy agreed and they separated, going in opposite directions. Barra headed for the exit. Just ignore them. She had to pass the pops. She stumbled and almost fell. Someone had tried to trip her. She didn't stop to name the culprit. Such occurrences were far too common to bother with. Say hi to Ken, Barbie, Louise taunted. Mocking titters followed her down the hall and out the door. They ended with the slam of wood against a metal door. One look around and her mood instantly improved. Everything was alive with wind and color. The air smelled of trees, damp but fresh. A falling leaf settled on her shoulder and worries fled. She paused long enough to wrap her scarf around her neck and made her way across St. Cat's wooded lawn. The Wisp is published on Amazon.com and also available from your local libraries and bookstores. All words and images are my own. The music is found in the public domain or the Creative Commons.